So how many are excited for tomorrow? Yes, of course. All of us are so excited. And we always have just this history, if you will, of loving the day that comes tomorrow. Of course, that is tax day. And Americans perhaps have a history of hating taxes. From the very beginning, no taxation without representation, to today of the phrase that has been quite common in recent years, taxation is theft. We'll talk about a couple of these ideas here in just a moment. But taxes have really been hated for quite some time before as well. We're going to be looking in Luke chapter 20. Luke chapter 20, in this lesson, Should We Pay? Luke chapter 20, and beginning in verse 19. This is going to be the foundation of our lesson for today, is out of this text. In Luke chapter 20, beginning in verse 19. Yes. So in verse 19, the scribes and the chief priests tried to lay hands on him that very hour, and they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them. So they watched him, and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, in order that they might catch him in some statement, so that they could deliver him to the rule and the authority of the governor. They asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach correctly, and you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Let me just pause here for a second. There could not be any more deceptive statement that they could possibly make than that one there. But they continue with their questions. And the first is this: Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But he detected their trickery and said to them, Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were unable to catch him in a saying in the presence of the people, and being amazed at his answer, they became silent. So they asked this question: Is this lawful? Is this lawful? Now there's several implied questions that they are asking here as well. But they want one of two outcomes to take place here. They either want him to just say, the Pharisees are hoping that he will just say a direct no, it is not lawful, so the Herodians can then turn them over to the Romans so that they can say, well, he is declaring treason against you and Caesar. And the Herodians, they're hoping for a direct yes. So the Pharisees will turn the Jews against them, against him, for being a Roman sympathizer. That's the hidden motivation that you see taking place there. You see it as well in the question that they ask concerning the resurrection. They have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who thought very differently on this point, that they came together for a moment in their mutual hatred of Jesus so that they could trap him in a saying. Well, this is one of those occasions. And they're asking, should we pay taxes? Now, there's two reasons, besides the fact that tomorrow is tax day, so the timing is fitting, but there's two reasons why I think that it is actually important for us to study this issue in particular. Because if there does ever come a time where we as Christians are persecuted, this is the last thing that we'll want to do, is to pay taxes to perhaps the government that is persecuting us. So we need to be prepared if that does ever come. And then as well is because perhaps in our area of the country in particular, I see more excuses for why Christians shouldn't have to pay taxes than perhaps in other parts of the country. And so I want to address some of these objections that really the Jews had in their own mind as well, in an implicit way. And so I believe that this is actually an important question for us as Christians to delve into. Should we pay? I'm going to jump straight to the answer first. The answer that Jesus does give is, give what belongs to him. If it belongs to him, give it to him. And so he takes a denarius. And he takes this denarius, and he pulls out a denarius in particular because there were other coins that didn't have Caesar's likeness. And so this one particularly did have his likeness, and he holds it up and says, whose likeness is on this coin? And they, of course, answer that it's Caesar's. And what he says is that shows that it belongs to Caesar. It belongs to him, so give what belongs to him. And we understand this principle. If we find a locket with a picture inside of a family, we would assume that there's someone that's in that picture that owns that locket. If we see a painting in a mansion with the family who lives there, we understand that that picture belongs to them. If we see someone's name on a driver's license with their photo on the driver's license, and we could go on with this same kind of reasoning, we understand that their image is there, and therefore it belongs to them. So we get this principle. So if we look at a dollar bill, or any type of legal tender in our country, and we see that it says the United States of America at the top, we understand the same principle. If it has the United States of America, then who does it belong to? But some people might say, yes, but we are the United States of America. And so we are the government, is how some people then reason. First of all, a little bit of an eye roll that I might give to that particular reasoning. But also, just above the United States of America, it says another phrase. At the very, very top of a dollar bill, it says Federal Reserve Note. So even if we were to dismiss that it says United States of America, and so we don't have to pay taxes because we are the United States of America, we are not the Federal Reserve. And anyone that tries to argue that point is going to be running in circles. And so we are not the Federal Reserve, and so Jesus' argument then would go thus. This ultimately doesn't belong to us. This dollar bill that we have ultimately doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the Federal Reserve. And so therefore, technically, it's theirs. And so give them what's theirs. There's another passage that talks about this idea. Keep your marker here in Luke chapter 20, but go over to Romans chapter 13. In Romans chapter 13, we'll begin in verse 1. Romans 13 and in verse 1. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause for fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, implicitly, to the government. Not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. He says this is a moral issue that we're talking about here. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Jesus says, and Paul, in agreement with it, says, it is what is due them. They are doing a good work for the Lord, that is, punishing evildoers. But then, of course, we have the question, well, what if they're not doing good for the Lord? What if they're actually the ones that are doing evil? We'll talk more about that here in just a moment, but I see no such exception within the Scriptures that says that if a government is not doing what they're supposed to be doing according to God, then that means that we are exempt from taxes. The taxes are still due them. It's theirs, It's their money to take, if they so please. Now, we may not even like that answer that Jesus gives, but it at least subverts the hypocrisy of those who were asking the question. But let's dig into the implicit questions that are being asked here in Luke chapter 20. First, we ask maybe the question, does it matter which tax that we're talking about here? Does it matter which tax? Now, if you look at the other accounts in Matthew and Mark that record this same event, it specifically has that they are asking about the poll tax. Do we have to pay the poll tax? And we can maybe hear it a little bit in the wording there, that if you were going to come to the polls, as it were, you had to pay this tax. Now that maybe is a little bit different variation based on the fact that they were not doing this whole voting process of putting Caesar into office or something like that, like we have. So maybe poll tax is not the best translation. But they were asking about this tax that they had that required that they pay this to live in the provinces of Rome in order to finance the occupying Roman army. This was not for Roman citizens, and it was not for, if you will, it was not also for those cities who were exempt from taxes in general. But it was specifically for those who lived outside of Rome that were living in the provinces under Roman authority and control, against their will, I might add, especially for the Jews, so that they could pay for the Roman army. And so this tax was especially hated by the Jews of this time because it implied two things. It implied first that the promised land of God belonged to Rome. That was the implication of this tax. But secondly, it implied that the Jews belonged to Rome as well. That if you are going to live here, then you have to pay this tax to say that you're ours to deal with. So the Jews hated this particular tax, which is why they ask about it. And ironically, when the temple was destroyed, therefore the temple tax was no longer taken. But when the temple was destroyed, they converted the temple tax into an additional poll tax when Vespasian destroyed the temple in AD 70. So Jerusalem is gone, the temple is gone, and now they have to pay the tax that they hate most of all, this poll tax, for them destroying their temple. And so we may look at different taxes and we may say, I get sales tax. That's what I often hear, is sales tax is like the only tax that's okay in some people's minds. So I get the sales tax because you're paying for it, and so there is a fee that goes along with that. But income taxes, they're unconstitutional, is what we often hear. Or property taxes, or insert your favorite tax to gripe over. But what we see here is that Luke doesn't specify poll tax, and Jesus in his response in all of the accounts never specifies what he is saying, but instead it just simply says, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar? So the poll tax is not the only tax that Jesus here is saying, yeah, the poll tax you have to pay, but everything else no big deal. I saw an article this last week that tried to make a Christian argument based on that idea. But instead, Jesus says, all of it belongs to Caesar. Every denarius that you possess belongs to Caesar. So give him what is due. Does it matter which tax? No, it doesn't seem to be the case. Does it matter who is the one who taxes? And so they might have said, and they were saying actually, this is our oppressor. We don't belong to Rome, and God wants them gone anyway. That's the reason the Messiah is coming, is so that he can wipe out Rome, so that we can be saved and at freedom and peace. And we may say something in response of, well, if Jesus demanded that even the Jews pay taxes to Rome, we might say, shouldn't that be enough for us as well? But instead, we hear responses that say, but have you seen the people that we have to pay taxes to in Washington? Have you seen who's in Washington? They are opposed to all things godly. They're taxing more than we can possibly bear, or at least more than some people can bear. Or at least that's how we feel. We feel like this is more than we can bear. My response, do you know the kingdom that Jesus was speaking into in this day? Because if we knew the history of what was going on in that day, that Jesus and the apostles were living in and speaking into concerning these taxes, I don't think we'd be making that argument. Tiberius, who was Caesar in Jesus' day, was cruel, vengeful, executed his political opponents without trial. Caligula, just after Tiberius, promoted all forms of sexual promiscuity, even in open public places, and also was cruel and violent. Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, all cruel, and all seem to put forward not only a sexual agenda, but also put forward their own status as a god in this world. Now, I don't know of any president that has tried to put themselves up on that kind of pedestal. So if you think that Caesar was more just than who we have in office either today or previously or in the offices of Congress or Senate, then we need to perhaps re-examine history of who Jesus was talking about. Again, there's no given exception here for governments being unjust. And it's not just to Caesar, but Paul broadens it out in Romans chapter 13 to any Christian in any government. Pay what is due them. So no, it doesn't seem to be that who we pay taxes to makes any difference. I'll have a little bit more to say about that here in a moment. But they're asking this question, is it lawful? What do they mean by that question? Well, there's a couple of ideas of what this could mean. And I think perhaps all of them are, what is at play? First is this idea of, are taxes against the law? Now, when we say the law, we're talking about the law of Moses. And in a way, they're asking a similar type of question as what Jesus was asking earlier in the chapter. In chapter 20, and backing up to verse 2, saying to him, tell us by what authority you are doing these things, and who is the one who gave you this authority? And Jesus answered and said to them, I also will ask you a question, and you tell me. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? In a way, they're trying to ask a very similar question here. They're trying to ask, are taxes from heaven or not? Are we allowed to pay taxes, or is that against the law of Moses? So they're trying to use a similar question against Jesus in their hypocrisy and feigned piety. And we still ask the same. Is this something that is according to the law of God? And that's exactly what people are asking when they say statements like, taxation is theft. I want to ask, where is that taught anywhere in the scriptures? That taxation is theft. I've heard preachers say this phrase, taxation is theft. But where is this taught in the scriptures? As well, we noted, the money is not ultimately yours. So if you don't pay what they charge to live here, you're actually the one that's kind of stealing from them because you're withholding what is due them. And not only is that a legal issue at that point, but according to Paul, it's a conscience issue. It's a moral issue to then take from the government what is due them. So are taxes against the law of Moses or the law of God? I don't believe so. Well, then maybe what they mean by, is it lawful? Beyond that is, well, are certain taxes just and fair? And they may be saying it more broadly, are taxes lawful? Are they just and fair? But perhaps they even have the idea of, are certain taxes just and fair? Well, the Old Testament discusses rulers who excessively take. We've already talked about the idea of that we maybe try to say, well, this tax is okay, but this tax is not. I want to just talk about excessive taxation for just a moment. Back in Amos chapter 5. In Amos chapter 5 and in verse 11. Amos 5 and verse 11. It's talking about those who are in leadership above, how they handle those who are poor. It says in verse 10, I'll back up, they hate him who reproves in the gate, and they abhor him who speaks with integrity. Therefore, because you impose heavy rent on the poor, and exact a tribute of grain from them, though you have built houses of well-hewn stone, yet you will not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, yet you will not drink their wine. For I know your transgressions are many, and your sins are great. You who distress the righteous and accept bribes, and turn aside the poor in the gate. It's been a long time that governments and leaders have imposed heavy burdens of taxation and usury on those who are underneath them. And God is not pleased with this. So there is a type of excessive taxation that could happen. And this is exactly the warning that was given by Samuel whenever the people asked for a king. They say, give us a king like the nations around in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And here is what God's response through Samuel is. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 and in verse 14, it says there, he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. If you want a government, if you want a king, then you better get ready because the king's going to ask you for a lot of taxes. That's what he tells the nation of Israel. But they say, give us a king anyway. That's what we want. But then heavy taxation is the exact reason why the kingdom of Israel split after Solomon dies. Because Rehoboam, he is pled with by the people saying, please do not burden us any further like your father burdened us with these taxes. And he says, you know what? I'm actually going to multiply your taxes even more. So the people reject Rehoboam, and they go and make their own kingdom. So we go back to American history, that people were saying, no taxation without representation. Your taxes are unjust and unfair. Or you have that some people will say even today, certain taxes are unconstitutional. We're asking this question, are these taxes just and fair? And many people say no. But even if they are an injustice, and even if they are unfair, what Jesus teaches us is when we are dealing with the government, do not return evil for evil. You go back to the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and we'll look at verse 38. Matthew 5, and beginning in verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat too. Whoever forces you or compels you to go 1 mile, go with him too. Now, this has almost just become a common phrase that we say, go the 2nd mile. And we know what that means in our own implications of that phrase. But when we really think about it, we might begin to question, why in the world is someone forcing you to go 1 mile to begin with? And that actually goes to that it was Roman law that in the provinces especially, a Roman soldier could take off his pack that he was wearing which often was somewhere like 60 to 100 pounds even sometimes. And they would take off their pack, and they would force someone who is in the provinces to go a mile carrying their 60 to 100 pound bag. Now, to me, that sounds like an excessive law. That sounds like an unfair law, even. Especially if you consider who it is that they're choosing. They might be choosing people that are hurt and badly injured, or the elderly that can't carry that weight, and they're still forcing them to take this, because you know how the Romans were. It is quite the case that people would just try to make people squirm that were under their rule. So perhaps that was taking place, but either way, this seems to be a very unjust law. And Jesus is using it in that sense, saying, this is not a fair law. Someone is slapping you on the cheek. And specifically, it's the government that's doing it. They're doing something that is not fair. It is not right. He says, not only should you go within the first mile, but go ahead and give him a second mile too. Now, that's not me suggesting that when it comes to taxes, not only give what you owe, but go ahead and give them $1,000 more, right? That's not what I'm suggesting here. But sometimes, even when it comes to the government, and even when they're being unjust and unfair, we take it. So then it goes to the last question that really is what seems to be in mind, perhaps, when we ask questions like, should we pay taxes? Is I'm really asking, do I like it? Do I have to like it? And I want to ask, where is this question being asked from a place of? Is it being asked from a place of justice? That we recognize that what they are doing is wrong? How they're using these funds is wrong, and I don't want to have to pay to that? If that's the case, I get it. I get it. And there's perhaps something to be said for that line of argumentation in particular. Do I have to like paying taxes in that sense of knowing what it is that America is going to use it for? Things like abortion, for instance. Do I have to like those things? And am I supporting those things? Rome was doing a lot of those same things with their dollar bills as well, if you will. Of course, not dollars. But they were doing the same things with these denarii. So do I have to like taxes in that sense? Maybe not. But if it is this idea of a foolish government doing wrong against us, maybe, in one way, we could actually find joy in paying taxes. Stick with me for just a moment. Look over in 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 17. 1 Peter 2 and verse 17. It says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Servants, be submissive to your masters in all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor if, for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right, which in our definition of tonight's lesson, part of what is right is paying taxes because that's what God tells you to do. But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. In this way, we could almost say that there is a sense in which, even though I know that they are doing wrong, I am still doing what is right. And in that way, there is a suffering that I am undergoing through that. But that's just what Jesus did too. He suffered what he did not want to do what is right. And in that way, I can be glad that in some way I get to suffer like my Lord. So are we asking from that place? Or are we asking, do I have to like it from a place of greed? This is my money. I earned it. I worked for it. And I want that bigger barn. Well, you and I both know where that leads. Look over in Luke chapter 12 where this is taken from, this idea of a bigger barn. Luke chapter 12 and verse 13. It says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." There's some sort of injustice that's taking place here. And Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?" Then he said to them, "Beware, and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist in his possessions." And then it goes and talks about that parable of the man who said, "I have all of these possessions, but I know what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build greater barns." He says, "You fool, your soul is required of you this night." But you look at what brought this parable about, and you think, if this guy's brother isn't sharing the inheritance like he's supposed to, then why is Jesus putting his hands off of this? Shouldn't he try to make this right? Doesn't the inheritance belong to this brother as well? We might think this is an injustice. But Jesus actually says, beware lest your greed bring you to failure. He actually rebukes the man and tells him, don't be greedy. But this is mine. This is what my parents left to us. This is mine. Or this is mine. This is what I earned this year. And I should get to keep every dime of it. Because I'm hoping for that bigger barn. Let us not ask this question from a place of greed. So is it lawful biblically for us to pay taxes? Well, it's theirs. Well, is it lawful legally? Again, well, it's theirs. Is it lawful morally? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. But it's not our job to steal from them what's theirs, or what they say is theirs, to get them back for their wrong. Vengeance, even with withholding our taxes, is for the Lord to determine. You do what's right, and you do what is good. But let's go back to the answer that Jesus gave to begin with, because we've only talked about half of the answer. But it's actually the second half of the answer that is the more difficult of the two. You give what belongs to him. That's the more challenging part of the command here. And that's what he hopes for them to understand. The problem with their question of, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar? The problem with their question is not the question in and of itself. It is that they are hypocrites and they are attacking the Son of God. That's the problem. Their hearts were not righteous, though they pretended such. And as such, Jesus commands not only to give what belongs to Caesar, but what belongs to God. And what is that? Well, you look at a coin. Whose image is there? Caesar's. Well, if his image is there, you give that to Caesar. You look at a man. You look at mankind. Whose image is there? Then you give what belongs to him. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus says how much of this is necessary. In Matthew chapter 22 and verse 36. Matthew 22 and verse 36. Very familiar passage. And one that we're actually going to be talking about 2 weeks from now as we come to where this is quoted from in Deuteronomy. In Matthew chapter 22 and in verse 36, Jesus says, well, first it is asked of him, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment." The most important commandment of all of the law of Moses, and Jesus implies even into my kingdom as well. The most important commandment is to give God absolutely everything that you are. So let's say we could pay taxes in cash. I don't know, Sherry, can you actually still do that? Can you pay tax? Yeah, you can't even pay taxes in cash, all right? But let's say for a moment that you could. And you actually would go to a place to pay these taxes in person. Well, you know what? I want to keep some of this. And so I take out my handy pair of scissors that I brought with me, and I take those bills, snip, 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 and it is still the same number of bills, and I try to hand it over to them. Here's your taxes. Here it is. I've given you what is due you. Not only are you going to have to serve 10 years in prison for cutting up money, but also it's worthless. You've ruined the value of it because you tried to give half of it. It's not worth anything anymore. And when you don't give God everything that His image is on, you're giving Him nothing. If you don't give God everything, you're giving Him nothing. You belong to Him. Especially if you've been purchased by Him. He owns you, doubly so, as a Christian. And if you don't give Him what He deserves, you're robbing God of what is due Him. And we can't feel about giving to God what is due to Him what we feel about giving what is due to the government in paying taxes. That, I don't really want to do this. This is tiresome. It is wearying to have to give this over to God. Or we just don't give Him anything, but we sit in church on Sundays. And at least we give that to Him. But every other hour and moment in the week is given to ourselves and our greed. God's blessings are good. He gives you life. He gives you salvation. We should want to give Him everything. But when you don't give God everything, you're giving Him nothing. So that's why Jesus says there's actually a moral implication to not paying taxes. It actually is a reflection on how you treat God as well. So be careful. Be warned. Should we pay? As much as you should pay your whole life and existence to God, because His image is on you. If you have not given everything over to the Master, repent tonight. Be made right with the Lord. And if you're ready to give Him everything in baptism for the forgiveness of your sins, you could not make a better decision tonight. And we ask you to please either come to the front or as soon as services are over, come to us. And we will help you take care of your soul's salvation. Whatever you need this evening, please come to the front while we stand and sing.